18 секунд, будемо починати.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andriy Shevchenko. I'm a co-founder of Ukraine Media Center, and now we are at Ukraine Media Center, Suspilne Space. And today we will be working in such a jazz format. We've all gathered here to discuss the year 2025. There will be presentations to liquefy our gray matter, and then we count on this discussion by the high qualified audience. And without further heat up, I'll give the floor to Mr. Igar, who will tell you more about this project. Good afternoon. My name is Igar Tyshkevich, Iliya Kusa, Vadym Denysenko. Well, in fact, it's not the first joint project of ours. In terms of presentations or forecasting, we've been doing it for 7 years in a row. We've been doing it in the Ukrainian Institute for Future. We had one of the most intense analyst teams there, and starting from this year we decided to do it on our own, and basically this is the first public presentation of a non-formal analytical network. Our network of analysts where the point of entry is the interest to our work not only from grant donors, but also for the representatives of international institutions, which means that if the analyst is interested, they can continue working on. It's a non-formal network. Again, it's a non-civil organization, and it's the first idea, like, okay, let's make this forecast for the next year. And ladies and gentlemen, that's a premiere. The presentation of the forecast 2025, quite a simple topic. Everybody understands what's going on. So straightforward to business. For what I understand, Iliya Kusa is about to start. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, it will be the shortest and to some extent and probably the simplest part of it. So let's try to go through it real quick. So we've started and we decided that when it comes to the forecasts and when it comes to our foreign policy, we have to start with studying our foreign partners with whom Ukraine cooperates, on whom it depends in certain areas. And it just happened so that after the November elections in the United States, we will be most likely severely dependent on what the new administration is going to bring to the office. We keep forgetting that the United States are guided by certain logic in their foreign policy. They've been doing it for years. They have a global task that can boil down to the following 4 points. It hasn't been changing within decades, at least. A little bit maybe after the split of the Soviet Union in the end of the 90s. The last 3 administrations of the United States, they were quite active in foreign policy to implement this global task. And it boils down to the fact that at some point the United States have realized that they cannot be or they cannot maintain the one polar world. They have no resources to be a global policeman, as they were called back in their days. And at some moment they started the movement towards not hegemony logic, but the leadership to withdraw from the principle of domination of one pole world towards more of a pragmatic vision of the United States as a global leader in the critical areas, but not more than that. if we analyze what the administrations of the United States were doing, starting from the Barack Obama administration and ended with the current Joe Biden administration, we will be able to see that the logic of implementation of this global task was still the same, even despite any differences in those administrations. We're used to the fact that there are Democrats and Republicans, and they are completely different compared to each other. But when it comes to the strategic logic of the United States, they were going to the same goal, just using different methods. And basically specifically starting with the second term of Barack Obama, it was clearly visible how they were moving from the concept of one polar war to the global positions of the United States in the world. But they were realizing that they would be just one of several leaders of the world. They started rethinking their global presence, and for what we see, the logic when Donald Trump came into office back in 2017, he did not turn the United States towards expansionist foreign policy inherent in George Bush Jr. times. So the difference was only that from Donald Trump's perspective, his team, those people surrounding him, their concept is on betting on the bilateral communication between the countries. Meanwhile, during the times of Obama and current administration, they trust more in alliances and multilateral institutions. But again, it's a matter of methods and ways. It's not a principal change of the role of the United States in the world. So we have to remember about this task in order to be able to discuss the foreign policy of the United States in terms of Russo-Ukrainian war. And it clearly explained why United States have taken this position back in 2022 that they've taken towards the war between Russia and Ukraine. It can be described in three phrases: localization of war, prevention of war spilling outside Ukraine, prevention of involvement of other countries in the war, to make sure that NATO countries don't get involved in the war, or Moldova doesn't get involved in the war. We're being told a lot about it. Then it's a guided escalation, the logic in which if we play escalation with Russia, it should be guided, it should be under control to the best extent possible, because uncontrolled escalation creates uncontrolled risks, which are unacceptable by the United States, and they pose a lot of problems that they don't want to multiply. We can tie a lot of decisions of the United States to this. I mean, from the perspective of the weapons that they were either handing or not handing over to Ukraine, and their careful reaction to certain events that unfolded in the course of Russo-Ukrainian war, and deterrent of Russian Federation, a concept of deterring, not destruction of Russia, not victory over Russia, but the deterrent, because such a concept doesn't contemplate that in this war Russia should suffer such a loss that it splits. It's not a goal of the United States by itself. For them, it's enough to create the system that would allow the partnerships, the alliances, to deter Russia from further expansion, restrict their potential, and gradually weaken their economy and military industry through sanctions. That is a concept that requires a lot of time and resources. This is why we have some contradictions with the United States, because Ukraine insists that we have no time, we need the results right now, but in the United States they say they can wait, and it's directly related to the perception of their position in the Russo-Ukrainian war. And based on that, what can we forecast in terms of foreign policy of the United States starting from January 2025? So this formula is going to preserve. Most likely, Donald Trump is not going to refuse it. It's not in contradiction with the idea of negotiations that we've been hearing a lot about during the pre-election race. Negotiation after a long-term competition with Russia to reduce the intensity of the conflict, it fully fits within the foreign policy logic of the United States, because they see the ceasefire concept as a tool of guided escalation. Something that I've just demonstrated, it fully fits within the logic of guided escalation. That's why this formula, those three elements of the foreign policy, are likely to be preserved. Then the peace through power, a concept that is being discussed a lot after the victory of Donald Trump. It's not a new term. During his first term, Donald Trump was discussing it a lot. We understand it as United States forcing Russia to peace with Ukraine using the lethal force against them. But in my opinion, judging by what I hear from the statements of the Trump team and based on what Kit Kellogg, who is supposed to be the key representative for Ukraine, is saying, they mean pressure to force Russia to negotiations as such. The conditions of such negotiations will be defined by other factors such as situation in the front lines, negotiation positions of the parties, and those who will take part in the negotiations, the mediators, and so on and so forth. Then restriction of security guarantees, definitely United States, or very likely United States, are going to consider some security guarantees for Ukraine in case a ceasefire agreement will be entered into. Those won't be security guarantees such as NATO membership, because Trump's position regarding Ukrainian membership is public. Everybody knows what it is. And those guarantees will be looking like supply of weapons to Ukraine in the long-term perspective, and guarantees related to establishing a system of deterrent of Russia in case the war would be suspended and the situation would unfreeze. The United States will proceed to using the instruments such as financial support and weapon supplies to Ukraine. Strategic stabilization will be the key leitmotif of Trump administration in our area. The global goal of the United States is to redistribute the presence of the United States, to optimize their spending in the international arena. They want to get reoriented to the region of Asia Pacific because they think that China is number one problem for the United States. It should be deterred. And from the perspective of Trump team members, the majority of them, there are some non-priority areas, and the Trump administration thinks they should not allocate as much fund as they used to. Those areas, we remember there were stories with Syria, Iraq. I think that this story will be repeated in the January 2025, and in the same way it's related to Ukraine in part. Well, why I'm saying in part? Because there are strategic interests present in Ukraine that are related to non-loss of reputation of a country which is capable of defending their allies, their partners. But the logic will be in strategic stabilization. They will need to stabilize the key areas to enable more time and resources to restructure the economy. That's the key topic of Donald Trump and many other American politicians, and to have more time to reorient their resources to the region of Asia Pacific. That's why in the logic of strategic stabilization, the idea of ceasefire is quite acceptable to them, because it gives them opportunity, gives them time, gives them stability and some predictability and optimization of spending. As I've mentioned, Donald Trump and his team, as well as other politicians who are adherents of this idea, are guided by the logic that the United States cannot spread all over the world, and to waste their efforts, they need to focus on the vital interests of the United States. From the perspective of Donald Trump and his aides, those vital interests are the economy of the United States, internal problems, China, to some extent everything related to nuclear security, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, Iran, North Korea, and here our war ends up in this story as well. But again, one way or another, they will be trying, and this is what they've been trying to do during the elections, when they were explaining to their voters why they are supposed to give less weapons to Ukraine, because they need to optimize the spending, to channel it to more important things that are more important from the point of view of the politicians and American voters. I mean, those politicians who will form the administration starting from the January 20. I mean, those whom Trump nominated for the key positions. So those are the 5 key points. You can perceive them as the 5 points that formulate the logic of the foreign policy of the United States starting from the January 2025. In this logic, they are more likely to move, and we have to respectively take it into account as we formulate our foreign policy and interaction with the United States. I have just one small question. It's quite unexpected to me to observe that not so many or not so radically the politics towards Ukraine is going to change. I think that many might think that a lot of things are about to change. I think that the real changes can be expected in reorientation of spending. Can you either confirm or debunk my observation? What should change during Trump's cadence? Well, the amount of support will change, most likely, because again, optimization of spending. I think that there will be an attempt. I don't believe and I don't think there will be a situation when just all of the support will be either suspended or cancelled. The strategic interest of United States in Ukraine will not disappear, but they will try to compensate it with the Europeans undertaking some amount of spending so that the United States could reduce funding to prove that Trump delivers on his promises to his voters. Thank you very much. And Vadym Denysenko, and no one's gonna get surprised, Russia. Thank you. Well, basically, I'll try to be as brief as possible, because no matter how surprising it sounds, the matter of Russia is the easiest in terms of prediction for the year 2025. When we talk about Russian society and Russia, we cannot omit what's going on in the Russian society, in Russian economy. So Russian society is divided into 3 parts. This is the sociology data that we've been gathering starting from the year 2022, and this is the sociology that is done by Russian field and even Levada and other statistic agencies of Russia. So we may say that 35% of Russians are those who are for the continuation for the war, including 7% of those. I mean, not 7% of those 35%, but of overall public are anti-Putin, which are part of those 35% of those who support the war. They are the foundation of the military policy of Putin. They're the foundation that Vladimir Putin is relying upon when he continues the war. So 35% is a figure that has grown 10% within the last 2 years of the war. In the beginning of the war, there were only 25% of those. 45% want the war to be over. They don't care about the border. I mean, they can even give away Energodar and other territories of Ukraine which are temporarily occupied, just say for Crimea. And 20% are those who will join the winner, but they are ready to support any resolution. And basically, before we proceed to the analysis of further actions by Putin, we have to stop at the 3 reasons why this full-scale invasion has started back in 2022. First, Russia de facto was losing the status of the third pole of the world. Secondly, Russia has lost policy and functions, unlimited, unrestricted policy and functions in the post-Soviet space. I'm talking about all of the countries of the post-Soviet space. And another is the war for the white race, because if we analyze those studies that we've made this year and those done by more or less adequate demographers, we may say that the amount of Slavic peoples will account for 70% of the population of Russian Federation, and until the year 2040 it would be 50-50, and Moscow would go ahead of other regions, and by the middle of the year of the century 21 there would be 60% of the Slavic population and the rest would be non-Slavic. And after this, the second half of the century, Russia would start the process of inversion of white race. I apologize before the purists, but this war is the war for the white race of Vladimir Putin, who was thinking that the loss of the white Slavic Orthodox population will result in loss of opportunities for so-called Russian civilization, the so-called Russian world. And basically, we have to understand that for the time being, no matter how the war develops, no matter what happens next, Putin has no single opportunity to solve those three problems that were the reasons to start the full-scale invasion. Again, I want to emphasize it, no single opportunity during his physical life, during his 15 or 10 years of life, but again, hopefully he will live shorter, but still, those problems cannot be solved within such a short period, and he clearly realizes it. Also, he clearly realizes that the continuation of this war makes Russia technologically dependent. Again, technologically, not politically dependent. Russia is not a political associate of China, but technologically, they slide into dependency on China. And third thing we have to remember that is beyond any logic in this presentation of mine when it comes to the logic of the year 2025 on part of Russia, there's a lot of illogical things that are related to psychology or even psychiatry. So basically stopping this war means for Putin telling himself that I've lost it. Personally, to himself, he's afraid to do this. His population is gonna accept anything, but he's afraid to tell it himself. So what's going on in the Russian economy? We're having quite a simple number here provided by our sociology. 62% of the Russians are on the brink of poverty. The people who either have no savings at all or have savings which would allow them to last for 1 month without jobs. So basically 2/3 of Russian population are on the brink of poverty. If things happen just in the way they're happening now, after the year 25, this figure will grow up to 67%, maybe 70%, and it would result in quite an optimistic forecast. What we're seeing now, the collapse of some sectors apart from the military-industrial complex, may say that by the end of the year 2025, the number of those who will be on the brink of poverty will be 67, 68%. But the logic of Vladimir Putin that started in year 23 boils down to simple things, choosing between macro stability and possibility to function three sectors, military-industrial complex, the army, and the pensioners. He's choosing macro stability because for him it's the opportunity to solve those problems that are within the logic, not so much logic, but within his psychology or psychiatry. When it comes to the black swans, black but predictable, that's an oxymoron, but in the beginning of the year 2024, I was saying that it would be the year of the multiple black swans. So I hardly recognize that a lot of people could predict the events in Syria in the beginning of this year. And no one could predict the coal sector would collapse. Currently, the coal sector is collapsing in Russia, and that's one of the global black swans that will catch up with them next year. Next year, they're really afraid to see riots in the coal-rich regions such as Kuzbas. So, talking about the predictable black swans, first of all, is the growth of the number of infrastructure catastrophes because they have no machinery, no people, no knowledge, no technologies to repair these or those things. What we've seen in the beginning of this year, when a lot of small towns started freezing in the winter in the beginning of this year, well, we don't know what's going to happen in the end of this year. In the worst, I've been there, and something's definitely poised to happen there. There are no spare parts, there are no people to maintain it, and what's even more important, there is lack of funding. Talking about the inflation processes compared to the last year, the spending for utility services was reduced at least 2%, and there are significant losses in funding predicted for the next year. So generally, we may say that what we can forecast now, the infrastructure catastrophes, they will be happening in Russia, and God help us if something good happens, something big happens. And when it comes to what Putin is afraid of and what can stop him, it's definitely the oil price. He's really afraid of the oil price crumbling. This is his only fear. So no matter what people say, he's not afraid of the sanctions against his shadow fleet, so-called shadow fleet. We have to use this term so-called shadow fleet because everybody knows the names of those ships. Everybody knows where this oil goes. But until this day, nobody was ever going to counter the very existence of this shadow fleet. And 60% of the oil that is exported from Russian Federation leaves Baltic ports. Many people call the Baltic Sea NATO lake, but somehow still 60% of Russian oil exports are going through the Baltic ports. So what can Putin be afraid of is the resolution of Trump, definitely not his unilateral resolution, but maybe Saudis and other parties involved who may assist to having the oil price crumbling. Shouldn't it be happened? Putin has no other fears because otherwise those huge amounts of money that he spends for the contract troops, it's getting depleted. His reserves, and starting from the 1st of December, another program, unprecedented program in the world to write off the credits. If you sign the contracts, they write off about $90,000 of your loan. The Russian experts say that Russians can contract 2 to 3 more million people, which is not real. They don't have any millions in reserve. There is a high probability that we may predict that shouldn't any global things happen, by the middle of the year 2025, the flow of those people who are ready to exchange money for life will dry up. But again, that's unpleasant for us because until the 25th of March, they will cover all of the problems related to announcement of new mobilization. Why 25th of March? Because this is when the system of booking in Russian Federation changes, and 100% booking is only preserved for the law enforcement and representatives of military-industrial complex. The others are liable to supply the request to this Moloch. I mean the mobilization of the conscripts. That's why the 1st of June will be the date starting from which Putin will be ready to announce the mobilization. Doesn't necessarily mean that he would announce it, but this option will be available to him starting with electronic draft notices and ending with an opportunity to conscript a lot of people at the same time, including regional government officials. So what are the main dilemmas of Putin? First is his fear resulting from external reasons. I've already mentioned the oil price, and should something big happen and China may say we stop providing a whole range of parts or products that can be used for multiple purposes. So those are the two things Putin is afraid of. And another thing why the war may end is the collapse of the front line and capitulation of Ukraine. Let's hope that's not going to happen. And now Putin is just trying to use his time, to bide his time. 2 hours ago, his press conference has ended. That proves this chronology. So until the 20th of January, the possibility of negotiations is very small. After Putin's press conference, we may say that it's unrealistic at all, or like 1% real. After the inauguration of Trump, some processes would start with different degrees of intensity, and they would last until the beginning of summer. If by the beginning of the summer the conflict is not frozen or suspended, there is a high probability that the probability of another cycle, annual cycle of war, will be entered. Well, whoever follows the analytics of Vadym Denysenko as to Russia knows that those are quite obscure forecasts, and among all those things, what you've just said looks quite optimistic. So among the factors that would influence the Putin's decisions, you haven't mentioned the situation in the front lines, save for the last slide. So the things related to the events unfolding in the battlefield, does it mean that we don't expect to see any significant changes, or does it mean that Russia will make decisions in a different way? Well, I'm not a military expert, that's why I try to comment the events in the front lines to the least extent possible, but for the time being, for what we see now, without significant technical help from our Western partners, I hardly imagine us to break the situation significantly in our favor in the battlefield. Thank you very much. Igar Tyshkevich, good afternoon. I apologize for the presentation to be in Russian, but I will make things better starting from the next year. So since it's not the first forecast, we were given another forecast for the year 2024, and we were saying that the war will likely, for 40% likeliness, there is a 40% likeliness that the war would continue in the year 2025. That was the key forecast, the key figure of our forecast. and we were predicting that 2 timeframes would not be used during the spring and after the elections in the United States, but the matter of Kursk operation, this is what Vadym has mentioned, that's the image of Putin. Russia cannot enter into any negotiations when part of them are occupied by Russia. Again, from the perspective of Russian sociology, there is Russia, there is Crimea, some unclear Donbass, and so-called the new territories. Basically, we may say that they can sacrifice something, except for Russia itself. Even Crimea, yeah, it can be painful, but again, if part of the historic territory of Russia is not controlled by the Russian government, it's not a picture of victory. Without such picture of victory, they will not resort to any negotiations, and this is exactly the format that was triggered. And now we're proceeding to the situation in Ukraine, because again, we've already mentioned the United States, Russia, so for us there are different challenges. First, the Trump factor. The change of approaches to the policies. It doesn't necessarily mean the change of policies, but the change of rhetorics. Then competition between the United States and China, depending on how they communicate between them. A lot depends for us in terms of continuation of war. Intensification of the role of EU, that's another important thing. 4, not so much have covered it, but Russia may try to scale up the conflict. They've entered in some regions into a conflict situation with the interests of other countries, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, the strike on France's interests that changed the rhetorics of Macron. Remember, they started from saving Putin's face to sending troops to Ukraine. It only took 1.5 years. Certain French interests in Africa. It will be another report about Russia in Africa, but again, some Russian interests in Africa, they are contrary to China and United States interests and interests of the local players. Syria, when this text was written, the anti-Assad forces have not proceeded even to the offensive, but we were realizing there are significant interests for Turkey there. And again, Turkey is another center of force now. Another thing Vadym has mentioned, prioritization of Russian economy. It doesn't mean that Russia doesn't have money. It doesn't mean that Russia cannot manufacture technologically complicated products. That's important because it's about transformation of Russia into a raw material economy, but now they don't have any space for maneuver. And the last thing is the attempt by Russia to intimidate others by scaling up the war. Well, nobody gives in to their nuclear blackmailing, so they will, or they may want to scale up the conflict. So again, situation in Ukraine is compared to the condition of the year 2024. Again, we evaluate the legitimacy of different groups, which means how different groups view the ruling class as those who are entitled to give orders. So again, economic resources is not only the funds, it's also the technologies, the possibility to create the added value. Then force resources is not only the front lines, it's the existence of the enforcement mechanisms to enforce your decisions. Again, organizational, again, that's this human resources pool for the government, the possibility to analyze the situations, to take adequate decisions, and technological, well, it can be covered. And foreign policy, we use the color code. So if two or more groups are in the red, it means uncontrolled crisis. Uncontrolled crisis means that the system only exists because none of the foreign players wants to take it apart until the very end. It's non-stable. If there are yellow and red fields, but they are not critical, it's the guided crisis or guided destabilization when the system, by using the available resources, can turn the situation to the stable condition, and the majority of the green is stability. So again, one by one, internal legitimacy. By the end of 2023, quite a high legitimacy of the government authorities, not only President Zelensky, and legitimacy of the war. In the year 2024, our sociology says that there is a catastrophic fall among the population to all of the government institutions, not covering President Zelensky so far, but the indicators of legitimacy of war are changing, but they are still in green, probably not so concentrated. Elites in the year 2023, yeah, they were supporting the existing course, and de facto they started working in the pre-election cycle. Different political groups started preparing to the elections. By the end of the year 2024, de facto the political system exists in the pre-election preparation mode, and there are changes in economy and tax area. Well, this is something that destroys the legitimacy indicators among the Ukrainian elites, both political and economical. And external legitimacy remains the same. Economic resources is a paradox, but it was improved. But however, this improvement is short-lasting. There are two factors from the point of view of economy. First, it's the mechanism that started working to hand over the proceeds from Russian assets to Ukraine. And another thing is that tax hike is dangerous for the year 2026, but it may result in the budget proceeds for the year 2025. In my opinion, it's not quite correct in the long-term perspective, but it provides stabilization for the year 2025. Law enforcement resources or enforcement resources or force, we have no opportunity to break the situation in the front lines so far, just like we don't have it now, and we didn't have a lot of opportunities in 23. So human resources, the human resources pool becomes less and less, so we are bound to some intense crisis of management. Ideological resources. Our ideologies that we were using previously are unreachable, but the problem is that the transition to the new ideologies is not yet formulated, and that new framework was not presented to the society. The most illustrative is such a complimentary interview by Yermak when he was asked what is the victory plan and what is the fair and just peace, and he didn't give the definition of the just peace de facto. So there is no ideological resource. If there is no ideological resource, there is no mechanism, there is no lever for you to lift the level of legitimacy. And finally, external support so far is still there. As Iliya mentioned, even in case of implementation of Trump policies, it will be just restructured. And for all those who were studying programming, this is a very representative scheme. Again, it was put together before the press conference of Putin and Belousov. However, it has a key axis, the context between Russia and China. So, or I apologize, the United States. So, first is the suggestion of Trump to end the war within 24 hours, the peace plan by Trump, and attempt to ask for Putin's consent and Zelensky's consent. If Zelensky doesn't agree, then there is economic pressure over Ukraine. If it doesn't happen, and you see the diamond there, compensation from the European Union, we're seeing it now. A part of European countries have already made that statement that they would increase the funding for Ukraine. And this is how we proceed to another big block. In this block, it has three key, so to say, branches. The first branch is how the relations will develop between the United States and China. So it remains at the same level. Igor, I have a suggestion. You know, the combination of Russian language and such a complicated slide. Maybe you will just disclose the essence, the summary, so to say, and then we will provide the slide to those who may wish to see it. Well, so the summary is that we have a certain number of reiterations of the cycle of pressure over Ukraine and Russia. So the first option, everything remains just like it is, and Ukraine demonstrates that we can deter Russia, stabilize the front line. It will result in support from the United States and European Union and extension of the war to the year 26. Option number 2, economic war between China and the United States, but without military confrontation. It means they won't threaten each other with weapons. An attempt to pull Russia from the economic dependency on China. Remember those Bush drumsticks. And then we come to another question. If Ukraine doesn't consent, the conflict is frozen. That's not a real suspension. If Ukraine doesn't consent, the cycles of pressure, economic pressure of Ukraine will continue. But Ukraine has a reserve of duration for 2 to 3 months, and which means that the next cycle will only start in another 3 months. So if Ukraine gets out of those cycles, the war will continue in the year 26. If Ukraine doesn't, or if Russia doesn't consent with the Trump's proposal, they exercise more pressure on Russia. So it means there is armed confrontation, but there is no war. And both China and the United States are interested in stabilizing the situation to avoid any black swans and to prevent the conflict from spilling over other countries and transform into a conflict between China and the United States. So for Ukraine, it's either the Minsk process or the Georgian scenario with this pressure exercised on both Ukraine and Russia. And another option, if two countries agree on the bipolar world, then it's an interesting scenario, because then we would be able to see something like a shared plan of Trump and Xi. So again, it's like a conditionally Georgian scenario, but with way more bonuses for Ukraine. And now let's proceed to the scenarios. So the freezing scenario, it contemplates ceasefire, truce. There may be some peacekeeping mission, but there is no foundation for negotiations. This scenario can contemplate, on one hand, certain reduction of sanctions imposed on Russia, lifting of some of the sanctions, but on the other hand, they would not be completely lifted. What it means for Ukraine is military support, but absence of NATO perspective, because freezing of conflict is not a NATO perspective. Well, talking about the Minsk scenario, it's in the text. It was explained in our recent Black Sea report, and in other report, the ending of war in the year 2023, and the Georgian scenario was interesting. The Georgian scenario can also be called Finnish or Korean, depending on the modality. The key principle, if we don't resort to Finnish definition, Ukraine demonstrates that it cannot liberate the temporarily occupied territories using the military force. They don't recognize the occupation politically. Respectively, Russia recognizes those territories as the part of Russian Federation, but they don't get international recognition, and thus this problem is postponed to the time after Putin. Why those three options? The worst case scenario is a Finnish scenario. It may result in a deep political crisis inside Ukraine. If the situation in the front lines is not in our favor, we will have to follow Finland's way in the year 1939 to recognize that part of the occupied territories are the territories of Russian Federation. That's the worst case scenario, which is possible if there is an armed confrontation between China and the United States and there is a pressure exercised over Russia and Ukraine. So Korean scenario is a strong partnership with a number of European countries and the United States of America, which undertake the obligation to support Ukraine with the weapons and training under certain conditions. It can be implementation of this case a part of Ukraine in NATO. And Georgian scenario, the worst for us. When the conflict is frozen, we recognize that we cannot liberate the territories, but we're falling into a deep political crisis on our end, and instead of South Korea, we're getting Georgia. This scenario contemplates elections in Ukraine, and we get our Verkhovna Rada reformatted. However, the President Zelensky retains certain changes for the second term, and he may succeed. And under Georgian and Finnish scenarios, there is a threat due to electoral cycle of the military authority, because should the Verkhovna Rada become incapable due to the presence of a number of small fractions which are belligerent, Ukraine is getting militarized, and from the point of view of trust to political institutions, the trust will be ruined and we will have the power of colonels. Well, the government of colonels. Well, thank you very much. I think that's a very interesting beginning of conversation in Ukraine Media Center. We'll love it when people with different views are gathering under one roof, and we'll definitely use this benefit of having such a motley audience here. Having a nourish to the audience. Whoever has questions, comments, remarks, if anybody has anything to say, please raise your hand, grab the microphone. I'm seeing the first hand over here. Good evening, Igor Popov. Everything sounds very interesting. So let me get a little bit deeper into Russian topic. If there is no suspension, if there is no conflict being frozen, there will be a long discussion who is guilty, who fails the negotiation. We will end up in a situation of a new confrontation, and to go to a new cycle, we need one party to get weakened, another one to get reinforced. So those factors that Vadym was mentioning, for example, mobilization, what will be the lag between announcement of mobilization until it starts influencing the Russian society? They've already made one cycle of mobilization back in 2022. They've mobilized 30,000. It undermined the trust. They've suspended the process. So how can we calculate when it becomes a political factor? Talking about funding and pensioners and economic factors, what the inflation should be, and again, within which term it can become the factor when the when this agreement within society is going to be undermined, when the masses are going to protest, again, the city of Orsk have never become a factor of political destabilization. So how many Orsk do we need to have those processes triggered? Again, if all those processes are triggered, will it influence the position of Kremlin? Will they resort to negotiations, or are we going back to some psychiatric phenomena? Should we wait for the change of regime to have the Russian policies changed? Well, let me start. Well, when it comes to the pressure over Russia, if they resort to escalation, there is such a thing as primitivization of Russian economy, dependency on certain part of critical materials, but there is certain lag, which is 2 to 3 months. In Ukraine, it's smaller, 2, maybe 3 in the best case. And in Russia, it's 3 for sure. So that the first thing that can happen in case of escalation, again, pressure by China and the United States, again, it's going to take 3 months. Another part, economy. It's not only about society, but economy as well. Recently, in the channel of Rostec, there was an interesting information about the manufacturing of machines. Russia is heavily dependent on the new machines. They import about 90% of them, and to maintain it at the same level, they have to procure the machines in the amount of 130 billion rubles. They only manufacture the machines in the amount of 24 billion rubles. Another economic factor is the level of income of the population. Again, clandestine mobilization. If previously they were using migrants quite actively, they were recruiting from other countries. Currently, those resources are, if not depleted, they don't provide as much outcome as they used to. Well, first of all, there is no linear answer to this question, like the inflation will be 20% and they crumble. In Turkey, the inflation is 80% and nothing terrible is happening. It all depends on how much money you still have in your pocket and how your incomes are indexed. That's why I think that the first thing, well, not everything, but a lot of things are going to depend on the external pressure. If this pressure intensifies and it will be multiplied by the oil prices crumbling, it will intensify the processes. But if it doesn't exist in this mode, Russian economy can continue for a couple of years. They can continue just like now in the new year. If they devaluated the ruble, our experts are going to rejoice that it was not predictable, but it still was very well predicted by the Russians themselves. But when it comes to the fluctuation in the society, we have to remember about one important thing. If FSB is facing the problem in one region, it's not a problem at all. Even if it's a riot, say, if it's not Orsk, but a meeting in Novosibirsk, say, involving 100,000 people, if it happens in 4 or 5 regions at the same time, FSB crumbles. So, apart from other factors, the total deterioration background, say, deterioration of life, when people see that there are some corruption scandals, you see there should be a lot of things happening in the background that would result in different, say, commotions at the same time in different regions, different in terms of their significance and their distance. We have to understand that Putin is heavily reliant on one place, Moscow. That's one of the greatest differences between today and previous days. Moscow is one of the most pro-Putin and pro-war regions of Russian Federation. As Russian economist Zubrevich has mentioned when she was asked, like, did all of the regions catch up with Moscow? No, they said it's the Moscow which caught up with those regions. They went way down. Well, in this audience, we have three heads of the committees of the voters of Ukraine. They were the key figures, and I would like to invite Mr. Alexander Chernenko to this conversation because we should mention the elections one way or another. I don't know if you have any questions to our panelists, but I'm having a question to you. What is your estimate? Are we going to have elections in Ukraine next year? What is the prospect? Well, you know, it's 50-50. They either are going to happen or not. But honestly, it depends. Everybody keeps talking about the elections. The talks intensified lately, but it all depends on which scenarios are going to unfold out of those that were described today. We understand that shouldn't there be any ceasefire, the option of elections would be unrealistic and even criminal to some extent. So when this moment is going to come, we still don't know. But if we keep saying that there will be some scenario in effect that contemplates the suspension, the freezing of the conflict, the issue of elections is going to arise eventually politically. Well, the fractions currently present in the parliament, they've signed such an agreement that at least 6 months from the ceasefire is a period necessary to organize the elections. That's the minimum for organization of normal elections, preparation of infrastructure, legislation, and so on and so forth. And again, it's too short of a period, but again, that agreement was only covering the parliamentary elections. No, that's the following question. What kind of elections are going to happen? Because in the year 2025, all of the election terms will be expired, like parliamentary, presidential elections, local governments. Again, if we do them separately, then why? Again, it raises a lot more questions, but what I'm trying to say is that should there be any ceasefire, there will be a public demand, and it will all take at least 3 months for the government to organize it. Probably even our foreign partners are going to close their eyes to this situation. However, under normal conditions, they would definitely criticize such a short term for preparation. But there's a lot of things they're currently closing their eyes to, and they can accept it without criticizing them. But again, 3 months is a very short term for realistically democratic elections and to have them organized. Obviously, in India, it may happen within a week, but the challenges are real huge. We are all aware of them: internal, external migration, infrastructure, register of voters. No country in the world has ever faced challenges like this. I really don't envy our electoral commissions and whoever will be involved, but today such talks about the elections in the beginning of the autumn or end of spring is just nothing, because there are no either security, political, legal grounds for any elections that I can see within a short-term perspective. Probably someday in the autumn of the year 25, but again, the probability is very, very little. Thank you very much. If any of our speakers has anything to respond, but if not, I would like to touch upon yet another topic. I see Mr. Taras Shevchenko in this audience, who until the recent moment was the deputy of the Minister of Culture for European integration. I would like to ask about the European Union. We've mentioned European Union recently in the context of new European policy. Probably some accents would be moved in those policies. And in Igor's presentation, there was a picture with Ursula von der Leyen and the former president of European Council, Mr. Michel. So to what extent European Union will be an important factor for Ukraine? Are we going to enter into a negotiation process? Well, thank you, Andriy. Let me add some of my thoughts. What I wanted to say that in the presentation of the panelists, there was a little mentioning of the European Union that was dictated by the specifics of those reports. But if we put it into the general framework, European Union doesn't seem to be such a powerful player. America keeps pushing it, pay more, make more contributions to your defense budget to push European Union to undertaking more responsibility. But the key idea I wanted to add to this discussion is a bit different. Under a number of scenarios that I agree to, there is a factor of a potential internal confrontation between the political elites after the elections, and in my opinion, the prospect of accession to European Union, the process itself, the fulfillment of all of the tasks is a significant consolidating factor that will involve political powers, because that's a topic that is definitely supported by all of the Ukrainians. When it comes to some micro processes, I mean that visa-free regime was a good consolidating factor. When it was discussed, different civil organizations, politicians were making their suggestions as to the indicators in the autumn of 2025, when there will be another report for spreading. The indicators for Ukraine are going to grow because the accent of the government previously was on screening, opening of negotiations, and as soon as screening is over in some areas, clear steps would be identified that the state has to do, and the accent and the focus will be on those steps directly. And fulfillment of those steps will give us even higher marks, higher estimates. And when it was Ukraine was criticized in the last report for not moving fast enough, it was still moving, and it was not supposed to move just as fast as it was expected. So again, I forecast positive movement, and hopefully this process, and I hope Europe, the European Union, is going to understand it, and the perspective will remain just as clear as it is, and it will be a uniting factor for both Ukrainian politicians and Ukrainian society. Thank you very much. In case you have any questions, any comments, any remarks, please raise your hand. I'm seeing one hand. Within the third presentation, can you please introduce yourself? Detector Media, Maria Baranivska. Within the third presentation, there was a statement made that we're fighting for the borders of the year 1991, and this ideology is not something that is extensively supported. Well, the representatives of power try to omit this topic, and for the majority of the society, this idea is not actual anymore. What's your evaluation of this condition? Is it neutral for us? Is it threatening for us? Is it something negative? According to your predictions, how the situation is going to evolve in the year 25, are we going to continue living in this indefinition? Well, what is the ideological resource? Is the key idea that is uniting the nation. It's a kind of a roadmap, like we're moving towards this and we are bound to achieve it. If this idea is getting more distant, if this idea becomes in contradiction with reality, it stops being this roadmap. It's something like, yeah, ahead of us, but what are we supposed to do right now, right? And in the beginning of the year 24, after the success in the front lines, yes, it was a roadmap for us. The year 1991, including Crimea. The end of the year 23 was a significant blow. The year 24 was even a harder blow. So we need some intermediate tasks that the government still cannot formulate and the society cannot formulate. It should be something symbolic, and in my opinion, it should be something real. Unfortunately, until this day, from the perspective of formulation of the real tasks, the state of Ukraine I mean both the government and the civil society, it doesn't work efficiently enough in terms of making the society united. Again, we have this resilience plan, another plan in energetics, and we keep discussing it. But guys, do we have any plan to increase the generating capacities? I think it would look more like truth, but still we understand there is a number of conditional generators we need to construct to be installed, and we need to construct a number of power reactors. But here we're talking about some theatrical play with beautiful wars, beautiful costumes. Well, emotionally, the population upheaval may last for just certain period, because on top of emotions we need some rational things. Again, it is the ideological resource, but the rational tasks are not proclaimed a lot in Ukraine. This is exactly why we're not catching up in ideological resource. Like we're saying things, we're doing things, we're saying things, we're doing things. Let me add something that the sociology shows that for the first time since the year 22, the number of people who insist on the war until the very end and the number of people who heavily rely on negotiations is almost equal now. It gives us the new realities with pluses and minuses. The minuses are obvious, but the pluses is to relieve the authorities from that pressure of those 95% who were expecting the parade in the Red Square within a week or so. So I'm seeing Vasily Samokhvalov raising her hand. Let me continue digging a little bit more in this area. My question is quite simple. What should Ukraine do in the year 2025? I'm talking about what should be the suggestion for Ukrainian society, what should Ukraine offer to its society, to the foreign partners, and what should be the negotiations positions. Well, I'm happy to have such a simple questions in our conversation. So let me ask, let me start. When it comes to our relations with the United States, on whom we definitely depend and we will continue to depend, in Ukraine we have two options. First, we don't like the trends the Trump team is moving along. For example, about the ceasefire, we need to find a way to convince the new United States president and his team to act differently. For example, that the idea of a ceasefire is bad, or that it should not be discussed in the first place, or that the continuation of war is desirable, or any other thing. He should be convinced. And this is the task of Ukrainian diplomats, to set up contacts on different levels and to somehow try to achieve it. Donald Trump, as we've been able to observe during his first term, cannot be called a person who never changes his opinion. It's the other way around. His administration, starting from the year 2017 until the year 2021, was quite flexible in a number of foreign policy aspects. So the change of opinion, change of view is completely normal. So we have a lot of changes here. How probable are they? How realistic are those changes? I don't know. It's a matter of negotiations and the availability of that resource to us. I want to believe it's still there. Another option, if we don't want or cannot convince the Americans due to some reasons, or if they've taken some principled position, the answer is obvious. We have to adjust to that option that would be suggested to us. It may sound unpleasant for us, but we have taken into account the foreign policies and the agendas of different countries that are one way or another involved in the situation in our country, including our Western partners. We just have to take it into account. In my opinion, we don't devote a lot of time to this, in my opinion. We don't devote a lot of time to analysis of their vision of victory, their plans. They have their vision of victory. It's the victory for President Trump. It's not disintegration of Russia, and it's not a defeat of Ukraine. It's a quick political solution that can be demonstrated to the Trump voters. Like, look, he delivered on his political promises. Well, I don't exclude we may see something new after the inauguration, but still, based on the statements that we know, that we've heard, again, let's wait for the January 20. Let's wait for all of the people nominated by Trump to be approved by the Senate and the official statements of the new administration as they take office. I mean, the statements about Ukraine before they start their diplomacy, headed by Kit Kellogg. Well, for what I understand, you described internal and foreign context, but Vasil's question is what we should do. Well, if you remember my presentation, there was a chart how stable this system can be, and that humongous chart that was unclear. Again, the key position is the position of European Union. In case of pressure exercised by the United States, would they compensate? Would the European Union intensify their support if United States do so? So, if you work with the closest circle, again, it was shock to me when the statement was made that the so-called agreements on cooperation in the defense sector are not and security sector are not a priority anymore. Well, from the very beginning, the idea of those bilateral agreements was formulated as a temporary story until we become a part of NATO. So, well, the agreements were about the economic cooperation, extension of our resource base. That was the only rational things in those agreements, because the rest was political declaration. So if you want the situation to be stable, if the European continent becomes a key priority to you, first, what are our relations with the neighbors? You cannot wage a war if you have conflicts with your neighbors. Then, again, are we talking about emotions and rational things? How frequently have we been discussing the interests of our neighbors? When it comes to the United States, we were afraid to mention that the support of Ukraine is the investments in the defense sector of the United States. We could use it as a key statement. We only start using it in year 2023. The position of France have changed in Africa. Have we ever analyzed how the Russian policies enraged Macron and French elites? And that's the game of interest. Because one thing is when you're saying, like, we're defending you, so give us the weapons. You know, for an Irish, it's not obvious that Ukraine is defending them against Russia. It's obvious maybe for a Polish, but not for a French or Irish. And the whole different thing is when you say, well, we have common interests and we may jointly achieve them. Another thing, again, division of the world and the interests. We were perceiving the world in such a way that there are allies who share the Ukrainian peace plan and the rest are against us. But again, ally is an obligation. And now we're transforming this formula of the 1991 borders. A year ago, those who were saying it's unrealistic, are they still with us or are they against us? Probably we have to change our foreign policy. Those who don't stand with Russia are potentially our allies, are not only those who applaud to every of our statements, those are our friends and the rest are the enemies. No, you don't win a war in this way. Well, Vasil, I apologize, but your question is a little bit incorrect because the answer was given to by Saakashvili, who said we need to establish the Office of Quick Solutions, and we know how it ended. So saying what we should do, every sector has 15 different answers, but here we're coming to the crucial moment. This Igor chart was saying we're on the brink of a global management crisis. Why are we expediting this crisis? Because we're trying to solve it with political methods. Well, it's not being solved in that way. The management crisis is only going to intensify if you replace one government official with another. So we should start with analysis, how and when this crisis started, and what it would entail, and how to solve it. So starting with the mobilization, enforced mobilization, that's a part of the management crisis. You don't have to be very, very clever to say that the things should be done in a different way, and probably that events would unfold in a different manner. So, it all goes from the very top to the very bottom, and when we talk about Africa and other regions, those are optional stories that result from management crisis. Again, we're on the brink of a global management crisis. We're only just entering it, and now we have opportunities to overcome it, to solve it in a systemic manner. I've seen a hand, even two hands. Well, probably some may have more questions or comments because we're about to wrap it up shortly. Well, Svetlana Ostapa, can you please tell us, is Ukraine is interested not only in the defeat of Russia, but in the disintegration of Russia? And is any of our partners interested in it? Can it be a uniting idea for Ukrainian society? Well, we have to set some realistic tasks. If we're setting the tasks that are not realistic, we may continue repeating it after the Chinese Tiananmen students. Be realistic, demand the impossible. And we know how it all ended. So we have to set the realistic tasks. The disintegration of Russia is not going to happen in a visible perspective. Should we be working on it? Definitely so, but is it our goal to have Russia disintegrated within 5 years? No, that's something similar to believing in wonders. Well, it's a matter of resources and plans. Like, okay, if we talk about the capitulation and disintegration of Russia, what is capitulation? Is when your capital is occupied. Do we have enough troops to occupy Moscow? If not, then the next question is, are we alone? Do we have allies? Do we have partners to have the allies contingent staying there? So if not, then it's a fairy tale for the children. It's a myth. If we don't confirm any of our desires with some real steps, that's only dreaming. I apologize, but it's so. If we're talking about the positions of other players, they're changing quite interestingly, because as of the end of the year 2022, when I was talking to the analysts from the European Union and so forth, the option of defeat and disintegration of Russia was scary because they've never analyzed it. If you have just vacuum, you don't know how to react to this. Now it's a less probable but still an option. And here we're coming to what depends on us. Okay, let's talk about the disintegration of Russia. But what is the role of Ukraine in this process? What are we going to do with the migration crisis, with arms trafficking crisis? How are we going to negotiate it with China? And without answers to those questions, none of our partners are going to talk with us, because the politicians, they analyze scenarios and opportunities. They don't analyze fantasies. If we have scenarios, we may be able to discuss it. If not, then no. Well, this topic is not being extensively discussed. It's present in the analytical discussions, but mostly as a risk. At least based on what I've read, it's perceived as a huge political crisis if we model those situations. It's a country with which the other countries will have to do something, and what to do nobody knows so far. And it's not a desirable scenario, it's not a priority for our Western partners. It only creates a lot of problems to somehow manage it, and it's only mentioned in the context of risks and not so frequently. And if I may, my small observation, what I'm seeing now in international security community, in the same way as Igor has mentioned it, now they started admitting that Russia, in their current borders, is not the best solution for the upcoming decades. And they started mentioning that the information sector, they should not only defend against Russia, but also think about offensive. Previously, it was the concept of fight against Russian misinformation was a priority. Now there is an idea of cognitive influence over the population of Russia. Those are the new accents, not only defense but also the offensive, and the role of Ukraine there may be quite intense. Well, let me add, like the main threat is, like Andriy has said, that currently, even due to the lack of activity of of Ukrainian state, all of the key analytical centers that deal with Russia, those who try to communicate it to the collective West, the information about what's going on in Russia, how it's going on, and where it's moving, they all belong to the Russians exclusively. We have to understand it, that even the most progressive centers, such as Berlin Center of Carnegie for Study of Russia, basically there is no single Ukrainian there. Somehow Armenians end up there, but not Ukrainians. And again, that's one of the global challenges that we are going to face in this context as well. Ladies and gentlemen, answers, questions, comments, remarks. Vladislav Martinyuk, Ukrainian Institute of Future. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. Quite an interesting report. There's a lot to ponder over, but there is one question in the context of the term of China. Should they ensure Russia's neutrality in the potential war against China? If so, would Russia agree to such scenario? But in your opinion, does Kremlin have enough experience to play this card, to use this situation to their own benefit? Again, and let's take another question or remark from the audience, from the floor. The mic is coming your way. I have just a small remark about this phrase that was ascribed to the Chinese. Be realistic, demand the impossible. Shouldn't Ukraine act under this principle previously? Yanukovych would stay for one more year here in the office. And secondly, we would have our government in exile in the spring of the year 22. So it's not a matter of being realistic to adjust to the existing reality, something that Ukrainian government is currently doing in the Trump track. We are trying to rush ahead of the locomotive. We're trying to agree to the plan that is not even yet formulated. We're already saying, yeah, we're ready. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, why did this principle work in the previous years? We had a lot of tools in our hands, not all of them. Some of them we were able to achieve through blackmailing, but still we had resources. We were able to use. When it comes to disintegration of Russia or liberation of the peoples colonized by Russia, the main problem is that it's not realistic. We don't really know whether it's realistic or not. Russia was disintegrating a number of times, and it was happening quite unexpectedly, but we don't have the tools. Even when it comes to cognitive influence over Russia, what tools is the West going to use to do that? I don't see any such tools personally. I think that's the main problem. When it comes to the war ending, when the capital of the country is occupied, using this logic, we may say that the Crimean War was won by Russia, and the First World War was won by Germany. There was no Entente soldiers in Berlin. So it's not a defining criteria. I'm not saying is the condition for loss that your troops should be stationed in the enemy's territory. Well, thank you. Well, I would like to add, Clausewitz said that the war is lost by that country that cannot politically continue it. So it's not even about the territory. Do we have any more questions or remarks? I think you can respond to what extent Russia can play this card of confrontation between US and China. Well, Kit Kellogg, who will be dealing with Ukrainian issue, he wrote an article with Frederick Fries back in 2022. Frederick Fries will also play some role in the new administration. So the statement about United States who have to offer Russia some agreement to reduce their cooperation with Russia, is there explanation why the United States have to proceed from unconditional support of Ukraine to such a restricted interaction with the idea of suspension of war? That's his rational statement, and not only his opinion. So on United States, and there is such a signal that bringing Russia closer to China, Iran, and North Korea is undesirable, and they see it as a product of war with Ukraine. Can Russia trade something for themselves on that? I think that it's their main expectation. Vadym may add something probably, but the strategic task of Russia is, it always has been, in becoming such a third pole of the world together with China and the United States, acting as a country which is capable of cooperating with those, and both parties would be interested in their neutrality. Well, thinking in geopolitical terms, in the terms of international relations, yeah, they will probably try to play this card. And let me add something as well. How probable is the war between the United States and China? So let me remind you of the story of the Cold War. How did it emerge? Because the hot war is expensive, and all of the countries will attempt to reduce the level of armed escalation. That's rational, that's logical. I don't see any reasons for Beijing or Washington to reject those scenarios, specifically when it comes to the threat of armed confrontation. The United States will do everything they can to pull Russia out of the Chinese sphere of influence. In the end of the year 21, there was a discussion about the tripolar world: Beijing, Washington, Moscow. Putin made his bet on this war to guarantee the status of Russia as a superpower. and he betted with his military power, which resulted to be not so intense. And thus, Russia is erasing itself from the list of global leaders. And this process is of benefit to both Washington and Beijing. They are ready to keep observing it as long as it doesn't create any problems for them. And from the point of view of confrontation between the United States and the People's Republic of China, for the United States, it's more beneficial for the war to end 5 minutes before the Russia is tied to the economic process in China. For the China, it's the other way around. It's the 5 minutes afterwards. I really apologize. Probably my Ukrainian is real bad, and probably I don't quite understand your remark, but you may have any goal. But if you don't try to support it with rational moves in attempt to achieve it, if you only continue dreaming, I apologize, but you continue dreaming. You're still a dreamer, and you've made a good statement. The quotation about the end of the war, when the country cannot politically continue it, rationality is to ensure the format under which we can politically continue the war. And if we enter into conflicts with everybody and we are only guided by our fantasies and dreams, and we put it categorically, either you're with us or not, and when we change our opinion, you change it with us, then we do everything we can in order to disable this opportunity of political continuation of the war. Well, let me draw this line with a simple question. Dynamo Kyiv or Shakhtar in the year 2025? Maybe there are more forecasts that you would like to cover. Well, the answer to this question is quite simple. What's the difference? Well, ladies and gentlemen, those were 2 hours of quite a fruitful intellectual labor. I appreciate everybody in this room, in this audience. I want to thank these 3 panelists who stimulated some thinking inside of our heads for the next year. So, Igar Tyshkevich, Iliya Kusa, Vadym Denysenko, Ukraine Media Center, Suspilne Space. Let our year 2025 be calm and bring us victory. Thank you.